The massive arena buzzed with alien voices speaking in dozens of languages David had never heard before. He sat quietly in the corner, watching creatures that looked like they had stepped out of nightmares and fairy tales alike. A being made entirely of purple crystals clicked and hummed to itself while reading data on a floating screen. Nearby, something that resembled a giant mantis with silver skin sharpened its claws on a metal block. David Reynolds adjusted his simple Earth uniform and tried not to feel out of place. Everyone else looked like they had been born for this moment. The crystalline being probably had natural armor. The mantis creature had weapons growing from its body. Even the small blue humanoids in the corner seemed to glow with some kind of inner energy. "Attention, contestants," a voice boomed across the arena. The speaker was tall and thin, with skin that shifted colors like oil on water. "Welcome to the Great Survival Trial. Every 100 years we gather the best from across the galaxy to test one simple question: which species truly knows how to survive?" David had heard about this competition from the Earth Council. They said it was an honor just to be invited. Most species sent their strongest warriors or their smartest scientists. Earth had sent him, a former military survival instructor who had spent the last 10 years studying alien plants and animals. "The rules are simple," the announcer continued. "You will be placed in a randomly selected hostile environment. You must survive for 30 standard days. You may take only basic tools, no advanced technology. No communication with your homeworld. No rescue unless you are about to die." A holographic wheel appeared in the center of the arena. It was covered with symbols and names in alien script. Each one represented a different death world somewhere in the galaxy. David had studied some of them during his trip here. Most were the kind of places that would kill a human in minutes. "The environment selection is completely random," the announcer said. "No species can prepare for specific conditions. This ensures a fair test of adaptability and intelligence." The crystalline being made a sound like breaking glass. David guessed. It was laughing. The mantis creature clicked its claws together in what might have been excitement. Everyone seemed confident they would get something they could handle. "Human representative, step forward." The announcer called. David stood up and walked to the center of the arena. All the alien eyes turned to him. He could feel their curiosity and their pity. Humans were still new to galactic society. Most species thought of them as barely civilized primitives who had gotten lucky with faster-than-light travel. The wheel began to spin. David watched the symbols blur together as it turned faster and faster. His heart pounded in his chest. There were hundreds of worlds on that wheel. Some were just extremely cold or hot. Others had crushing gravity or toxic air. A few were so dangerous that even the toughest aliens rarely survived them. The wheel slowed down. David could see individual symbols now. It passed a world covered in acid rain. Then one with gravity so strong it would crush most beings flat. It was slowing down more. The wheel stopped. The arena went completely silent. Even the crystalline being stopped humming. David looked at the symbol. The wheel had landed. He could not read the alien text, but he could see the fear in the announcer's shifting colors. "The human has been assigned to Morax 7, the announcer said quietly. A ripple of shocked sounds went through the arena. David had never heard of Morax 7, but from the reactions around him, it was bad. "Very bad. Perhaps we should spin again," said a voice from the crowd. "Morax 7 is not suitable for carbon-based life forms." "The wheel has decided," the announcer replied, but David could hear doubt in its voice. "The human will be transported to Morax 7 in 1 standard hour. Prepare your basic survival kit." David walked back to his corner as the other contestants whispered among themselves. He pulled out his datapad and searched for information about Morax 7. What he found made his stomach turn cold. Morax the 7th was a world with no oxygen. The atmosphere was mostly methane and ammonia with traces of xenon. The gravity was almost twice Earth normal. The temperature swung from far below freezing to dangerously hot every day. The surface was covered in toxic lakes and sharp crystal. Formations. It was the kind of world that would kill a human in minutes without a spacesuit. Even with a spacesuit, the harsh conditions would make survival nearly impossible. The longest anyone had ever lasted on Morax 7 was 6 days, and that was a silicon-based life form that did not need oxygen. David looked at his basic survival kit. It contained a small shelter, basic tools, water purification tablets, some food, and an emergency beacon. Nothing that would help him breathe on a world with no oxygen. His suit had a small air recycler that would give him maybe 3 days of breathing time. If he was careful, the other contestants were still talking about him. He heard the word impossible in several languages. Some of them sounded sorry for him. Others seemed excited to have one less competitor to worry about. "Time to go, human," the announcer said. "Transportation is ready." David stood up and shouldered his pack. He was scared, but he was also angry. Everyone expected him to fail. They thought humans were weak and stupid. Maybe they were right, but David had survived in places that had killed other people. He had lived through desert heat and Arctic cold. He had found food and water where others had starved. Morax 7 might be the worst place in the galaxy, but David was not going to give up without a fight. He was going to show these aliens what humans could do when they had to survive. The transport chamber was small and cold. David strapped himself in and closed his eyes as the machine hummed to life. In a few hours, he would be alone on a world that wanted to kill him. But he was not going to think about that now. He was going to think about winning the transport chamber filled with light, and David felt the familiar sensation of faster-than-light travel. When it stopped, he would be on Morax 7. Ready or not, the real test was about to begin. The crash landing knocked the wind out of David's lungs and left him seeing stars. His transport pod had hit the ground hard, throwing him against the padded walls despite the safety harness. When the spinning stopped, he could hear the harsh wind of an alien world howling outside the pod's hull. David unbuckled himself and checked his equipment. The pod systems were all red lights and warning beeps. The landing had been rough, but everything looked intact. His suit was working, his air recycler was functioning, and his basic survival kit was undamaged. He pressed the button to open the pod's door. It hissed open, revealing a landscape that looked like something from a nightmare. The sky was a sickly yellow-green color, and the air shimmered with heat waves despite the cold readings on his suit's display. Strange crystal formations jutted up from the ground like broken teeth, and pools of liquid methane reflected the alien sky. David stepped out of the pod and immediately felt the heavy gravity trying to pull him down. Walking was going to be exhausting. Every step would take almost twice as much effort as it did on Earth. He checked his suit's readings again. The atmosphere was exactly as bad as he had expected. Methane, ammonia, xenon, and trace amounts of other gases that would kill him in seconds. His oxygen supply showed 72 hours of air remaining. That was not much time to figure out how to survive on a world with no breathable atmosphere. The first thing David noticed was the smell. Even through his suit's filters, he could detect the sharp, chemical stench of the alien air. It reminded him of cleaning products mixed with rotten eggs. The second thing he noticed was the sound. The wind here made a low, moaning noise as it blew between the crystal formations. David pulled out his scanner and began taking readings of everything around him. The crystals were mostly silicon and sulfur compounds. The methane pools were deeper than they looked and contained traces of organic compounds. The soil was acidic and full of minerals he had never seen before. But the most interesting thing was the moss. It grew everywhere, covering the crystals and the ground between the methane pools. It glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light that pulsed in slow, hypnotic patterns. David had never seen anything like it. Most plants needed sunlight to survive, but this moss seemed to be thriving in the toxic atmosphere of Morax 7. David knelt down and carefully collected a sample of the moss. Through his suit's microscope, he could see that it was unlike any plant he had studied. The cellular structure was complex, with multiple chambers and what looked like tiny chemical factories inside each cell. He set up his basic laboratory equipment and began running tests. The moss was definitely alive, but it was not photosynthetic like earth plants. Instead, it seemed to be feeding on the chemicals in the atmosphere. It was breaking down methane and ammonia and turning them into something else. David's heart began to race as he realized what he was looking at. This was not just a plant, it was a living chemical processor. It was taking the toxic gases that filled Morax 7's atmosphere and converting them into other compounds through a process he had never seen before. The most exciting discovery came when he analyzed the moss's waste products. Mixed in with various organic compounds, he found traces of oxygen. It was a tiny amount, but it was definitely there. The moss was producing oxygen as a byproduct of its metabolism. David sat back and stared at the glowing moss covering the landscape. Around him, an idea was forming in his mind. It was crazy and dangerous and probably impossible, but it was the only chance he had. What if he could use the moss to create breathable air? He spent the next several hours collecting samples and running tests. The moss was remarkably adaptable. It could grow in different temperatures and seemed to thrive in the specific atmospheric conditions of Morax 7. More importantly, the more moss he gathered in one place, the more oxygen it seemed to produce. David's suit computer chimed a warning. His oxygen supply was down to 60 hours. He had been working for half a day already, and he was no closer to solving his survival problem. But he was beginning to understand how the moss worked. The key was the atmosphere itself. The moss needed the specific mix of gases found on Morax 7 to function. It was not just eating methane or ammonia. It was using the complex interactions between all the different chemicals in the air to power its metabolism. David set up his emergency shelter near a large patch of the glowing moss. The shelter was a simple dome made of flexible materials that could maintain a basic environment. It was not designed to be a long-term home, but it would have to do. Inside the shelter, David began his first experiment. He created a small, sealed chamber using part of his survival kit. He filled it with the local atmosphere and added a large sample of the moss. Then he waited. The moss began to glow brighter as it settled into the chamber. David watched his instruments as the chemical composition inside the chamber slowly changed. The methane levels dropped, the ammonia levels dropped, and slowly, very slowly, the oxygen levels rose. It was working. The moss was converting the toxic atmosphere into something closer to breathable air. But it was not working fast enough. At the current rate, it would take days to produce enough oxygen for even a few minutes of breathing. David's oxygen supply dropped to 50 hours. He needed to find a way to speed up the process, or he was going to die on this alien world. Just like everyone expected, he looked out at the vast landscape of Morax 7, covered in the glowing moss that might be his salvation. Somewhere in this alien ecosystem was the key to survival. He just had to find it before his air ran out. The wind howled outside his shelter, and the methane pools reflected the strange light of the alien sky. David had never felt more alone, or more determined. He was going to crack this problem no matter what it took. David's hands shook as he worked on his second attempt at a moss cultivation system. His oxygen supply was down to 36 hours, and his first experiment had failed spectacularly. The sealed chamber he had created produced a toxic cloud of hydrogen sulfide that nearly killed him when he opened it to check the results. The problem was pressure. The moss needed the specific atmospheric pressure of Morax 7 to function properly. When he sealed it in a small chamber, it could not process the gases correctly. David realized he needed to think bigger. Using the flexible walls of his emergency shelter, David created a much larger cultivation space. He divided it into sections, each with a different atmospheric mixture. In one section, he concentrated the methane. In another, he added extra ammonia. The third section contained the natural atmosphere of Morax 7 unchanged. He placed samples of the glowing moss in each section and watched what happened. The moss in the natural atmosphere continued to glow steadily. The moss in the methane-heavy section began to pulse faster. But the moss in the ammonia section started to change color, shifting from its normal blue-green to a deep purple. David took readings from each section. The purple moss was producing different chemicals than the blue-green variety. More importantly, it was producing them much faster. When he combined the output from all three sections, the oxygen levels rose dramatically. The discovery excited him, but it also scared him. He was essentially creating a new form of life support system using alien organisms he barely understood. If he made a mistake, he could poison himself with toxic gases or create something that would consume all the oxygen instead of producing it. With 24 hours of air remaining, David built his third and most ambitious moss cultivation system. He connected multiple chambers in a loop, allowing the atmosphere to flow from one to the next. Each chamber contained a different variety of moss, processing the air in stages. The first chamber contained normal moss that began breaking down the methane and ammonia. The second chamber had the purple moss that processed the intermediate chemicals. The third chamber held a variety of moss he had found growing near the methane pools, which seemed to specialize in final chemical conversion. David held his breath as he activated the system. The moss began to glow brighter as the atmosphere cycled through the chambers. His instruments showed the chemical composition changing rapidly. Methane levels dropped, ammonia levels dropped, and oxygen levels began to rise, but something was wrong. The system was producing oxygen, but it was also producing other gases. Some of them were harmless, but others were toxic. David realized he needed a way to filter the output. He remembered the crystal formations outside his shelter. When he had first scanned them, he had found they were porous and had natural filtering properties. David suited up and went outside to collect samples of different crystals. Back in his shelter, David crushed the crystals and created a series of natural filters. Each type of crystal removed different chemicals from the gas mixture. By running the moss system's output through the right combination of filters, he could remove most of the toxic compounds while preserving the oxygen. His air supply dropped to 18 hours. David was getting lightheaded, and his hands were starting to shake from the stress. But his moss system was working better than before. The oxygen concentration in the final chamber was approaching levels that might be breathable. David made the most dangerous decision of his life. He created a small breathing mask connected to his moss system and prepared to test it. If it worked, he could extend his life on Morak 7 indefinitely. If it failed, he would die faster than if he just rationed his remaining air. The first breath through the moss system tasted terrible. The air was thin and had a sharp, metallic flavor that made him want to cough. But it was air, and his body accepted it. David took another breath, then another. His oxygen monitor showed that he was getting enough air to survive, but just barely. The moss system was working, but it was not efficient enough to support normal activity. David would have to move slowly and carefully to avoid using more oxygen than the system could provide over the next few hours. David refined his moss breather system. He added more chambers, experimented with different moss varieties, and improved his filtration system. Slowly, the air quality improved. The breakthrough came when David discovered that the moss responded to carbon dioxide. When he breathed into the system, adding his exhaled CO2 to the mixture, the moss became more active and produced more oxygen. It was like the moss wanted to work with him, creating a symbiotic relationship. David's original air supply ran out during the night, but he did not notice. He was breathing entirely through his moss system now, and it was working perfectly. The air still tasted strange, but it was keeping him alive. As dawn broke over Morak 7, David looked at his creation with pride and amazement. He had built a living air purification system using alien organisms and basic materials. The moss was not just keeping him alive. It was thriving, growing larger and more efficient with each passing hour. David realized he had done something that no one else in the galaxy had ever accomplished. He had created a biological life support system that could function indefinitely on a world with no oxygen. The moss breather was not just a survival tool. It was proof that humans could adapt to any environment if they were creative enough. He spent the rest of the day expanding his moss cultivation system and improving its efficiency. By evening, he had enough oxygen production to support several people. The system was so effective that he was beginning to think about long-term survival instead of just making it through the next day. David looked out at the alien landscape of Morax 7 and smiled. Everyone had expected him to die here. Instead, he was turning this hostile world into a place where humans could live. The moss breather was just the beginning. 2 weeks had passed since David first breathed through his moss system, and Morax 7 was beginning to feel like home. What had started as a desperate survival experiment had grown into something much more impressive. David now had 7 different moss cultivation areas spread across a square kilometer of the planet's surface. Each cultivation area specialized in a different aspect of atmospheric processing. The main facility near his shelter handled basic oxygen production. A secondary site focused on removing toxic compounds from the air. A third location worked on temperature regulation, using the moss's heat-producing metabolism to warm the surrounding area. David had discovered that the moss was far more intelligent than he had first realized. When he moved samples from one location to another, they adapted to their new environment within hours. When he introduced new chemicals to their diet, they developed new metabolic pathways to process them. The real breakthrough came when David realized the moss was learning from him. When he spent time near a cultivation area, the moss there became more efficient at producing oxygen. When he talked to the moss, explaining what he was trying to accomplish, it seemed to respond by adjusting its chemical output. David began to think of the moss not as a tool he was using, but as a partner he was working with. He developed a routine of visiting each cultivation area every day, checking on the moss's health and making adjustments to improve its performance. The results were remarkable. His oxygen levels were now higher than they had been in his original space suit. The air quality was so good that he could work for hours without getting tired. He was breathing better on Morax 7 than he had in many places on Earth. But David was not content with just surviving. He wanted to thrive. He began experimenting with other aspects of the planet's ecosystem. The methane pools contained organic compounds that could be processed into food. The crystal formations could be shaped into tools and building materials. David's most ambitious project was a protein farm. He had discovered that certain types of fungi grew well in the processed atmosphere his moss system produced. These fungi were rich in proteins and vitamins that his body needed. By cultivating them alongside the moss, he created a complete life support system that could sustain human life indefinitely. The temperature control system was another major achievement. Morax 7's climate swung from dangerously cold to uncomfortably hot every day. David learned to use the moss's metabolic heat to warm his living areas during the cold periods. During the hot periods, he could slow down the moss's activity to reduce heat production. Water was never a problem. The atmospheric processing system produced water as a byproduct, and David had built collection systems that gave him more clean water than he could use. He even created a small lake near his main cultivation area, where he could bathe and wash his equipment. 3 weeks into his stay on Morax 7, David received his first communication from the monitoring station. The message was simple: status. Report requested. Are you still alive? David's response was longer than they probably expected. He sent detailed reports on his atmospheric processing system, his food production methods, and his environmental control techniques. He included video footage of his moss gardens and data on the chemical composition of the air he was breathing. The response came back within hours. Data verification required. Claims appear impossible. David smiled as he prepared his second report. He included complete technical specifications for his moss cultivation system, step-by-step instructions for replicating his results, and an invitation for the monitoring team to visit his facility. By the 4th week, David had transformed a significant portion of Morax the 7th surface. His moss gardens covered several square kilometers, and the air quality in the area was approaching Earth normal. Small animals had begun appearing near his cultivation areas. Attracted by the improved atmosphere, David realized he was not just surviving on Morax 7, he was terraforming it. The moss was spreading beyond his original cultivation areas, adapting to new locations and continuing to improve the air quality wherever it grew. The most exciting development was the discovery that his moss cultivation techniques could be scaled up dramatically. David calculated that with enough time and resources, he could make large portions of Morax 7 habitable for human life. The planet that was supposed to test his survival skills was becoming humanity's first successful terraforming project. David spent his final days on Morax 7 documenting everything he had learned. He created detailed guides for moss cultivation, atmospheric processing, and environmental adaptation. He mapped the areas where his techniques would work best and identified resources that future colonists would need. On his last night on the planet, David sat in his comfortable shelter, breathing clean air produced by his moss partners and eating food grown in his protein farms. Through the transparent walls of his shelter, he could see the glowing moss gardens stretching to the horizon. He had come to Morax the 7th expecting to die. Instead, he had created a new form of life support technology that could revolutionize space exploration. His moss breather system was not just a survival tool. It was a bridge between human ingenuity and alien ecosystems. David looked at the data pad where he had recorded his final report. The monitoring station would receive it in a few hours, along with samples of his moss and complete technical specifications for his systems. He wondered what the other species would think when they realized what humans could accomplish when they had to adapt or die. The moss in his shelter pulsed with soft light, as if responding to his thoughts. David reached out and touched one of the glowing patches. It felt warm and alive, like a living partner that had helped him survive in an impossible place. Tomorrow, the extraction team would arrive to take him back to the arena. But David knew he would return to Morax 7 someday. There was still so much to learn, so much to build, so much to explore. The planet that had been chosen to kill him had become his greatest achievement. The extraction team arrived at Morax 7 expecting to find a corpse. Instead, they found David Reynolds working in a garden that glowed with alien light, breathing fresh air on a planet that had no oxygen when he arrived. The team leader, a tall being with silver skin and multiple eyes, stared at the moss cultivation areas that stretched across the landscape. "This is impossible," she said in perfect English. "The atmospheric readings show oxygen levels that should not exist on this planet." David wiped his hands on a cloth and smiled. "Nothing is impossible if you work with the ecosystem instead of fighting against it," he said. "Would you like a tour of the facility?" The extraction team spent 3 hours examining David's moss breather system. They took atmospheric readings, analyzed the moss samples, and documented the environmental changes that had occurred over the past month. Their initial skepticism turned to amazement as they realized what they were seeing. "You have created a functional terraforming system using only basic tools and native organisms," the team leader said. "The atmospheric processing efficiency is higher than anything we have seen from advanced technological civilizations." David showed them the protein farms, the water collection systems, and the temperature control methods he had developed. The team took detailed scans of everything, clearly excited by the implications of what they were seeing. "The Galactic Council will want to study this immediately," one of the team members said. This technology could revolutionize colonization efforts throughout the galaxy. The trip back to the arena took several days, and David spent the time writing his final report. He documented not just his survival techniques, but his observations about the moss's intelligence and adaptability. He included recommendations for future research and suggestions for scaling up his methods. When David walked into the arena, the other contestants who had survived their trials looked at him with new respect. Word had already spread about his achievement on Morax 7. The crystalline being who had laughed at him during the selection process now approached him with obvious curiosity. "We analyzed the preliminary data from your trial," the being said in a voice like wind chimes. "Your success rate exceeds theoretical maximums for biological atmospheric processing. How did you achieve such efficiency?" David explained his discovery, that the moss responded to human presence and seemed to want to work cooperatively. The other contestants listened with fascination as he described the symbiotic relationship he had developed with the alien organisms. "Most species approach hostile environments with the goal of conquering them," said the reptilian contestant who had barely survived his own trial. "Humans seem to approach them with the goal of partnering with them." The formal presentation of results took place in the main council chamber. Representatives from dozens of species had gathered to hear about the trials. David's presentation was scheduled last, which usually meant the judges expected it to be the least interesting. When David began showing his data, the chamber fell silent. The atmospheric processing charts showed results that defied conventional understanding. The video footage of his moss gardens looked like something from a paradise world, not the toxic wasteland that was Morax 7. "The human contestant has achieved something unprecedented," announced the head judge. "He has not only survived in an environment that should have killed him within hours, but has actively improved that environment using techniques that appear to be entirely new to galactic science." The questioning that followed was intense. Scientists from multiple species wanted to understand how David had achieved such remarkable results. Some suggested that he had somehow cheated, but the monitoring data proved that he had used only materials found on Morax 7 and basic tools. "The key is not to fight the ecosystem," David explained. "The key is to understand it and work with it. The moss wanted to process the atmosphere. I just helped it do that more efficiently." The final vote was unanimous. David had not just won the survival trial. He had demonstrated a form of adaptive intelligence that none of the other species had anticipated. His success was not just about personal survival. It was about transformation and partnership. The awards ceremony was unlike anything David had expected. Instead of simply declaring him the winner, the Galactic Council announced the creation of a new research initiative focused on human-style biological adaptation techniques. David was invited to lead the program. "Your species has shown us a new way to think about hostile environments," the council leader said. "We have always assumed that survival meant imposing our will on alien worlds. You have shown us that survival can mean creating partnerships with alien life forms." David's moss cultivation techniques were immediately classified as breakthrough technology. Research teams from across the galaxy requested access to his methods. The planet Morax 7 was designated as a protected research site where scientists could study the ongoing terraforming effects of his moss gardens. The most significant development came when David returned to Earth. The human government had already begun planning colonization missions based on his techniques. Worlds that had been considered uninhabitable were now being evaluated as potential homes for humanity. David's success had implications beyond just survival techniques. It demonstrated that humans had a unique approach to problem solving that could be valuable to the entire galactic community. Instead of being seen as primitive newcomers, humans were now recognized as innovative partners in the expansion of life throughout the universe. 6 months after the trial, David received a message from the monitoring station at Morax 7. The moss gardens he had left behind were still thriving and spreading. The atmospheric improvements were continuing, and the planet was becoming more habitable every day. David smiled as he read the report. His moss partners were still working, still adapting, still improving their world. The planet that had been chosen to test his survival had become proof that humans could turn any hostile environment into a place where life could flourish. The Great Survival Trial had been designed to test which species was best at surviving. David had shown them something better. He had shown them which species was best at helping life thrive. No matter how impossible the circumstances seemed, the moss breather had become more than a survival tool. It had become a symbol of human ingenuity and a bridge between species that had seemed too different to work together. David had not just survived the trial. He had changed how the entire galaxy thought about survival itself.